Harvard Divinity School.
Uses and abuses of power in alternative spiritualities. Implications for spiritual care of patients and communities. April 27th, 2023.
Hello, my name is Pegi Eyers, and I am an independent scholar, published author, and an activist living in the Autonomy watershed in southern Ontario, Canada, which is the traditional territory of the Mississauga Ojibwe. I self-identify as a Celtic animist and a member of the ancient European Hellenic clan through my mitochondrial DNA, and I also have more recent roots in both England and Scotland. My particular research interests are social justice, Indigenous knowledge, alternative spiritualities, eco-psychology, and the ancestral arts. The title of my presentation today is Unconscious Colonialism. Why is Native spirituality a pagan genre? Entrenched definitions and genres are incredibly hard to dismantle, even those created in the early days of modern paganism. And yet, what if those original definitions were blind spots, rooted in an unconscious colonialism? Being placed within pagan modalities for quite a few decades now, the genre of native spirituality has been a convenience directed entirely by white people. In today's hopeful climate of Turtle Island First Nations resurgence and healing, and in alignment with anti-racism, social justice, and uncolonization efforts everywhere, the interrogation of the native spirituality genre under the pagan umbrella is long overdue. For many years in pagan spaces, I've noticed the use of the term native spirituality in books, articles, online chat rooms, conferences, and even manifestos. I've also been hearing from First Nations how the term pagan has toxic associations for them, and how native spirituality as a genre is offensive. White people have been able to reclaim the term pagan in healthy ways from the oppression perpetuated by the European religious powers. And yet, native spirituality has become a subgenre without permission or consultation with First Nations or asking them how they feel about the matter. Of course, pre-colonial worldviews all over the world share timeless values of animism, nature stewardship, and right relationship with Earth community, but who has decided that these traditions are pagan? This inquiry is not about exclusion or inclusion or an attempt to control or police anyone who finds their home in contemporary paganism. It is an inquiry on the assumption that pagan, the same label used to attack First Nations with genocide, oppression, and assimilation, would be acceptable today. In terms of my own positionality as a white anti-racism educator and scholar-practitioner of the ancestral arts, may I also say that I do not speak for First Nations, but that everything in my critique is readily available in the public domain. And I would encourage any person from any ethnic background to join in the struggle to dismantle white supremacy and racism wherever it is found. This quotation represents an Indigenous voice that is crucial to this conversation. What offends me is the categorization of Indigenous spirituality as a genre or an option for those shopping around for earth-based spiritual practices. The heart of our traditional teachings and ceremonies, even the more contemporary practices, have been here for as long as we have. Our ancestors walked this life path here on Anishinaabe Aki, long before New Agers, Wiccans, and modern pagans. G. Horton Baptiste, Sato Anishinaabe. So let's examine how this neo-colonial assumption got going in the first place by looking to early pagan publications. Shockingly, many mentions of indigenous tribes in the early days of paganism reinforce white supremacist and racist views held by the overculture. For example, what are we to make of these references from the pagan classic, Drawing Down the Moon, witches, druids, goddess worshippers, and other pagans in America, first published in 1986, and again republished in 2006. So these are a couple of the quotes from that book. Pagans retain rituals and ecstatic techniques used only by small and forgotten tribal groups. Another one. Neo-pagans are reclaiming sources such as the teachings and practices of the remaining Aboriginal peoples. And one more. All wholesome pagan ways, such as the American Indians, have influence. So also, in Drawing Down the Moon, a section on the Haudenosaunee newspaper Akwesasne Notes, now defunct, conflates Indigenous philosophy with white paganism, without speculating whether First Nations would want to be referred to as pagan. And why was there a focus on this particular Indigenous publication? I would venture to say that this inclusion was normalized, and yet it is a blatant example of what has come to be known as tokenism. One or two accessible teachers or publications cannot be cherry-picked as accurate representations from the entire Indigenous collective, especially if the vast majority are just beginning to recover from the dark years of cultural genocide and residential schools. Looking back, we can see that the rise of paganism in the Americas was a white middle-class phenomenon, and that the quotations in Drawing Down the Moon exhibit subtle racism, implicit bias, and microaggressions, as well as being colonial statements that deny Indigenous people the capability to survive and thrive. The notion of forgotten or few remaining are hard to apologize for in the face of contemporary population explosion within Turtle Island First Nations and the resurgence of tribal sovereignty and Indigenous knowledge. Did the early pagans really think that Indigenous people were a thing of the past? The mind boggles at the basic research they could have done to find out what was actually happening within First Nations and refute the colonial agenda. So as the growth of Native spirituality over the years consolidated as a genre under the pagan banner, let's examine some key issues of Pangaea magazine that focus exclusively on Native traditions and traditional cultures. In the winter 1998-99 issue entitled Who Shall Honor the Land? Paganism and Native Traditions, we find two good articles on pursuing European Reconstructionism as an alternative to cultural appropriation, which includes one progressive statement: if you want to worship in the Native American way, you should stand up for the rights of Indigenous people. Otherwise, in the issue, there is only the briefest mention of oppression or the living conditions experienced by First Nations. Earth connectivity from the white perspective is well covered, and of course, the ubiquitous tokenization of traditional shamans, in this case, the Olchi of Siberia and the Orisha of Brazil, with direct transmission narratives reinforcing the idea that any white pagan can embrace shamanic or Umbanda traditions, should they so desire. Only one First Nations author makes an appearance in the entire issue, with a column on her own decolonization. At the end of the issue, we are offered an op-ed from the publisher of the now-defunct magazine Magical Blend, who critiques cultural appropriation, but also ends with the trope, we are all one, plus the statement that he will continue to print material on white-directed shamanism as knowledge will set us free. So here he is actually apologizing in advance to First Nations for this kind of hypocrisy. In reality, this sidestep is typical of the white neoliberal impulse to make small gestures of respect, while the real focus continues to be on privilege and access. Overall, this issue offers white entitlement, white positionality, white fantasies of being adopted in, and questionable boundary lines. Ideally, any publication with a theme of paganism and Native traditions would include content on the impact of colonization on First Nations, current First Nations resistance and survivance efforts, how to take responsibility for our white privilege and implicit bias, and what white folks can do as allies and accomplices. Obviously, these essential issues were too challenging, not only for BBI Media as the publisher, but for their pagan audience. The meme making the round on Facebook that says, everyone loves the native who talks about peace, love, forgiveness, nature, and spirituality, but no one loves the native who talks about genocide, racism, poverty, injustice, and colonialism, is a perfect descriptor of this dynamic. Keeping the trendy attraction to native spirituality going, the summer 2000 issue of Pangaea magazine hit the stands with the leading title, White Questions, Red Answers. Can Traditional Cultures Save the World? Highlights include an editorial page that asks some key questions, the seminal essay, Wanting to be Indian, and a column that engages in a thoughtful way with the debate on transplanting European practices to the Americas. Other than that, articles on the typical spiritual tourism spectrum make an appearance, with forays to the Huicol of Mexico and the Engano of Colombia. A recent papal apology is covered, without any mention of First Nations or the papal bulls, manifest destiny, or the doctrine of discovery policies that made the genocide of millions of Indigenous people possible. Survivors' stories are also featured by well-meaning pagan salvationist types who talk about First Nations trauma, but they don't see the solutions, or themselves as part of the solutions. Other columns from white passing folks express identity confusion and the desire to claim Native affiliation. And while other articles are well-meaning, they were written by folks who were later outed for being non-Native. All in all, this issue is a major display of unexamined white perspective and white privilege. Without going on to dissect Circle magazine, published by Circle Sanctuary in quite so much detail, turning to a random sampling of issues entitled Sacred Feathers, 2008, and Shamanic Voices, 2013, we see that the genres of native spirituality and shamanism as part of paganism have truly taken root. In these issues, the usual push and pull between boundary lines makes an appearance. The advice seems to be, don't worry, if First Nations are too protective of their ways, there's always shamanism. There is a strange lack of First Nations voices in these issues, or any discourse on the fallout First Nations are still experiencing from settler colonialism. On the one hand, we find prominent pagans decrying cultural appropriation and the use of shaman as a self-identifier, but then there are pages and pages of white folks who are doing exactly that. The cover of the Sacred Feathers issue is a disgrace, with its stereotypical depiction of a hypersexualized First Nations woman. In the face of the ongoing violence directed toward Indigenous women, with racist attacks, erasure, objectification, rape, and murder, this magazine cover reinforces stereotypes and eliminates any hope for cultural sensitivity or allyship with First Nations. Viewing through an uncolonized lens, these magazines primarily serve a pagan obsession with the exotic other that has morphed into objectification, commodification, and the fetishing of all things native. In recent decades, the alarming number of white folks seeking guidance from First Nations elders has led to spiritual tourism and a new Indigenous industry that caters to white privilege. In terms of stereotypes, the good-hearted holy man, the sacred knowledge holder, and the wise medicine woman appear in too many pagan spaces and publications to mention. And yet, when a genuine First Nations person is not available for a polytheistic or multi-faith pagan gathering, we often find that the Indigenous representative turns out to be a white pretendian. Perhaps the tendency for white people to replace Indigenous people is deliberate, as there is no unsavory talk of poverty or genocide at that point. As just one example of this phenomena, in the 2005 anthology entitled Celebrating the Pagan Soul, our own stories of inspiration and community, we find a description of a multicultural circle exchanging winter solstice teachings. The allegedly First Nations piece is offered by a white man with no Native affiliations, but he states that he has adopted the Native American practices of the Lakota people. Paganism is riddled with frauds who claim that they have the right to represent First Nations. But instead of being normalized, I would suggest that this behavior needs to be called out as erasure and spiritual colonialism. And lastly, and possibly the most egregious example, in 2008, we see how Native spirituality has become entrenched as a pagan category within a pagan testament, the literary heritage of the world's oldest new religion. The editor runs through a variety of stories from all over the world, but sandwiched in between the Venus of Willendorf and Inanna of Sumeria, the origin myth of the Anishinaabe of the Great Lakes region appears, the woman who fell from the sky. Without any preamble whatsoever, anthropological or otherwise, it is not clear why this particular narrative is even included, or why it was handpicked from thousands of other First Nations on Turtle Island, each having their own unique language and sacred knowledge. How can anyone determine that a story lifted from the epic, all-encompassing worldviews of the Anishinaabe, equivalent to any religious system in the world, should be included in a pagan anthology? Like all Indigenous knowledge, the epistemology of the Anishinaabe is a cultural treasure and an irreplaceable part of the ethnosphere, which is the collective human legacy and the web of cultural diversity on planet Earth, and it can be hardly reduced to one story. The attitude of white entitlement here is astounding, and the lack of responsibility is highly offensive to First Nations and their allies. So this quotation represents another Indigenous voice that is crucial to this conversation. My spirituality is very much tied to the land, as it is for many First Nations, and I have a hard time calling it spirituality, as that is an English word. As Indigenous people, we have our own words, practices, and societies that facilitate our communication with the land and our ancestors. And I don't think pagan is a word that can describe what I feel or practice on the land. So to come full circle and examine why placing First Nations under the pagan umbrella is such a massive mistake, we can see how the label of pagan fueled genocidal policy toward First Nations in Canada until recent times. From his memoir in the book Speaking My Truth, Reflections on Reconciliation in Residential School, Anishinaabe elder Fred Kelly informs us on settler colonialism. In his own words, he says that the residential school system was set up to convert wretched pagan souls and take children away from the pagan influence of their parents, far away from their homelands to reserves in other regions. Pagans had no rights, were not defined as persons under the law, and were the wards of the government. Churches had legal custody of every Indigenous child, with their care and treatment, and the total and unquestioned discretion of the churches and their personnel. Being subject to brainwashing, punishment, and forced assimilation, children were beaten and humiliated out of their culture and spirituality, which was supposedly pagan and of the devil. They were punished for speaking their own language. Their traditional clothing was taken away and replaced with uniforms. They were in a constant state of fear and were frequently punished because they were pagan. Children no longer had access to family, clan, traditional teachings, life ways, their own spirituality, or their elders. As we let Fred Kelly's testimonial sink in and resonate with what it means for Indigenous people to be called pagan, it's also time we stop the colonial habit of labeling African diasporic religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, Shintoism, or any other tradition pagan. On Turtle Island, the original Earth Keepers have their own self-identifiers that predate colonial overlays. categories and labels. All groups have their own names for their tribes, communities, and social organizations, and they are probably not interested in being referred to by yet another European classification. Gratuitously calling non-Western groups pagan is not benign, but a colossal mistake, a sad reminder of the imperialist Western thinking of settler colonialism in the Americas, and representative of the toxic worldview our own ancestors created. Of course, there is a huge movement today toward anti-racism, social justice, and uncolonization within modern paganism, but many are still stuck in the unconscious attitudes of the overculture. Even in times of widespread cultural pluralism, aspects of the official pagan narrative can still replicate colonial behavior. In terms of action points, by examining pagan material in reference to First Nations over the years, we can then determine if there has been an attempt to essentialize, appropriate, romanticize, misinterpret, trivialize, or whitewash. And then we can consider how these misconceptions can be corrected going forward. If we ask our First Nations friends and acquaintances if they consider themselves to be pagans, I think that we will find in those answers an overwhelming need for change. Thank you very much.
Sponsored by the Program for the Evolution of Spirituality.
Copyright 2023, the President and Fellows of Harvard College.